Mr. Chairman, I yield my time to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Benz.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Moran. Mr. Secretary, before I start, I just want to talk briefly about what I heard earlier. One of my colleagues from across the aisle suggested that we Republicans were somehow manufacturing outrage. The phrase was right-wing outrage machine was the phrase that he used. I thought, are the folks across the aisle not outraged about the millions of people that are coming across the border under of course, your watch, that most of whom probably don't qualify for asylum? Don't you think that all of us should be outraged about the thousands dying from fentanyl that's coming across the border under your watch? And don't you think that we should be outraged about cartels moving into American cities on this side of the border under your watch? And don't you think we should be outraged about the billions of dollars the cartels are raising from the most unfortunate and vulnerable from Central America and other places under your watch? And don't you think we should be outraged about the hundreds dying in the desert? I mean, yeah, it's hard to argue, I think, that we're manufacturing outrage when we look at these incredible, sad things happening under your watch. Now, I want to go to how we can fix, perhaps, some of that which you've been talking about for the last couple of hours. Because you said earlier, in response to a question from Congressman Issa, that the USA is not, quote, alone in some of its infirmities in its immigration system. I'm just quoting from you, I scribbled it down quickly. Infirmities in our immigration system. Give us a couple.
I'm sorry, a couple?
Infirmities in our immigration system is how you put it when you were comparing our immigration system to others across the world. Just share two.
Let me give you one example in the economic arena. The market needs of our country, the economic needs of our country are not taken into account when we admit economic migrants. We have statutory caps, statutory limits on the number of people we can admit despite perhaps a greater need at a particular time. We do not calibrate the number according to need.
Right.
So for example,
I actually understand what you're saying. Forgive me for cutting you off, but it leads very, very nicely to how we might address immigration as a comprehensive system. And don't you think that politically, at least, a secure border is an essential prerequisite to any comprehensive solution? Because what you were just starting to talk about was one of the adjustments we might make to our visa systems. And by the way, I'm enthusiastic about trying to improve those visa systems. But I'll tell you this much, if I go back home to all of my constituents, as I'm going to be doing this Friday, and I'm going to be talking to them on Monday at a Chamber of Commerce meeting, guess what? They're outraged about the things I mentioned earlier. And they're not going to want to listen to me talk about the details that you just suggested. And so tell me, what can we do? Those infirmities, do they include anything when it comes to fixing the border so it works better?
yes.
Tell me.
So for example, Congressman, and one of the measures that we have taken to address this infirmity is to issue a regulation that empowers our asylum officers to make the ultimate asylum adjudication and shrink the time in between an encounter at the border and the ultimate asylum adjudication. That duration now, historically, has been 6+ years.
Thank you
That is
for your
an
thoughts on that.
infirmity.
Thank you for your thoughts on that, and I'd like to follow up with you on it, if you would. I'm serious. Share with me your thinking on that issue. Is it correct, as we heard, I've been to the border 3 times, and the folks down there suggest that the cartels are extracting between $3,000 and $5,000, maybe more, per person that presents illegally at the border. Is that true?
Yes, Congressman.
And so that would mean as the millions of people come in, we can multiply that times $4,000 or $5,000. Is that correct?
Congressman, that is correct, which is precisely why one of our efforts is to cut the smugglers out of the equation because of the profits they make, because of their ruthlessness, because of their criminality. And so
and forgive me for cutting you off, but I agreed to yield the balance of my time to the chair, Mr.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding. Mr. Secretary, is the number of people removed been through adjudication?
Objection, Mr. Chairman. This isn't Mr. Bentz's time.
That's right.
It was yielded to Mr. Bentz.
I know, but I thought we could get away with it because it was an important question.
Well, Mr. Chairman, you can have the next person yield.
Mr. Chairman, I
We're
yield
going to
back.
do that. Yeah. All right. Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and that was not done with any ill will. It
No,
was just out of procedure.
I knew that from the get-go.
Yes. Mr. Secretary, I know it's been a long day already. I want you to know that I'm here today to use my 5 minutes in support of a group of 250,000 plus young people in our country who are referred to as the documented dreamers. They're a too often forgotten population of talented young adults who are American in every way except on paper. And as I'm sure you're aware, since we've talked about them a few times, the documented dreamers are dependent children of long-term employment visa holders who are brought to the United States with documentation when their parents move here to work. And often these children come to the United States when they're still babies, but because they were not born here, they don't have citizenship or a real path to citizenship before they become 21. And while many of these young adults are in line for green cards with their parents, the backlog at USCIS is so long that they often face a decades-long wait. As a result, they risk having to self-deport when they turn 21 and age out of their dependent visas if they cannot find another status to stay in the United States legally. I have a bipartisan, bicameral bill to provide these children and young adults with a pathway to permanent residency protections for aging out of the immigration system. And I'm working hard to get that through the House and Senate. We got it through in 2 different forms last Congress through the House. However, today I want to hear about what your department is doing to protect these deserving young people and enable them to stay here. We've educated them using our tax dollars which their parents pay. They often self-deport to countries that compete with us at age 21 after having a few years of college. And so I'll get into at least one of my questions. In a 2014 decision on whether the Child Status Protection Act requires priority date for retention for children who have aged out of their visa, the Supreme Court deferred to agency interpretation of CSPA, which does not provide for a priority date retention for most individuals who turn 21 while waiting for green cards sought by their parents. However, Justice Kagan, writing for the plurality, emphasized that CSPA permits, not that it requires, this narrow interpretation of the statute that USCIS currently holds. Allowing documented dreamers to retain their original priority date and keep their place in line after they age out of their dependent visas could significantly improve the lives of this population. Why has USCIS not adopted a priority date retention for these individuals, given that the Supreme Court determined that the agency possesses this authority?
Congresswoman, I will consult with the Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services and get back to you. I'm not familiar with that precise issue.
Okay. I only have about a minute left. So when I met with the documented dreamers, which I do quite frequently because they have learned how to petition the government for redress of their grievances, I am struck by the love of this country and their eagerness to contribute to all of our welfare. And their stories are some of the most compelling that I've heard during my time in Congress. Does your department have any plans to protect these deserving young adults who have done everything right, been here legally, and are losing their ability to live in this country through no fault of their own?
Congresswoman, I share your concern for these individuals who have indeed contributed so much to this country and who know no other country but this one. I can assure you I will follow up with vigilance on the questions that you have posed and respond as promptly as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield my time to you.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Secretary, is the number greater than 0? Can you tell us that? The number of people who've been encountered on the border, over the 2 million number, encountered on the border, put in removal proceedings, adjudicated, and then removed. Is that number greater than 0?
Yes.
Is it greater than 100?
Yes.
Greater than 1,000?
Congressman, Mr. Chairman, forgive me. Mr. Chairman, as I have stated before, the data that you wish to have, we will provide to you as promptly as possible. What I don't want to do is misspeak when it comes to data. I do not want to be
And I can appreciate that, but we have a history where we've asked questions before in a hearing. You told us the same thing and you don't get it back to us. So we're trying to get as much as we can on the record in a public hearing. And you've now told me it's greater than 100, but you don't know if it's greater than 1,000 out of the 2-point-something million who've come to the country, been encountered and put in removal proceedings. So we know it's greater than 100. You say you're going to get back with us, but the history has been not too good on your part in getting us those answers.
Mr. Chairman, of course it's more than 1,000. But what I want to assure you of, because
Is
quite
it more
frankly,
than 100,000?
Because quite frankly, Mr. Chairman, we have been cooperative with this
No, you
committee.
haven't.
We have provided you with documents. We have provided you with data.
I can
We have
keep
made
putting up the
briefings.
redacted documents, but you have not. I would yield back to the gentleman. I appreciate the time, so he can yield to another member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield my time to Mr. Johnson from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Mayorkas. In answer to my questions earlier today, you defined misinformation and you acknowledged that CISA created in 2021 the Misinformation and Disinformation Committee. On April 27, 2022, you testified in the House Appropriations Committee that your department created then another agency or another subdivision, the Disinformation Governance Board, and you said under oath it was to combat misinformation ahead of the 2022 elections. Earlier this month, the federal court in the landmark case of Missouri v. Biden affirmed lengthy findings of fact to justify its preliminary injunction, and in the ruling found at page 94, the White House and your agency pressured and encouraged social media companies to suppress free speech that you determined, you and your employees determined to be misinformation. However, a couple of hours ago, when I asked you about this, you said under oath, we don't do that. Which time were you telling the truth, today or on April 27, 2022?
Congressman, we do not suppress free speech.
Did you or anyone working for you work with the social media companies prior to the 2022 election to pull things off the internet, suppress things off the internet that your folks determined to be false or misinformation?
Not to my knowledge, Congressman.
So you had no idea what the Misinformation and Disinformation Committee was doing during that period?
Congressman, I have answered that question previously. Let me assure you that we safeguard the First Amendment rights of individuals. That is what we do. Let me explain to you what the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency does.
I know all
with
about
respect-
CISA. What I'm concerned about is this committee and the dystopian Disinformation Governance Board that you set up and put Nina Jankowicz in charge of for about 3 weeks until the public blew their tops over that, and that suddenly disappeared and she resigned. How did you instruct Nina Jankowicz to discern what is misinformation and false information that the government should pull off the internet?
You are assuming facts that actually did not exist.
Tell me what the facts are. What guidance did you give her?
Congressman, the reality is that disinformation is a tool that adverse nation states use to undermine our democracy.
Okay.
4 adverse nation states include
No, hold on. Don't talk about foreign adversaries, because the court and the witnesses on your behalf in the court testifying under oath, different than what you're saying today, that they made no distinction between foreign people who put things on the internet and domestic voices. Do you disagree with that statement?
Congressman, can you share with me the context of that
It
statement?
would be awesome if you had read the federal court opinion that directly says that your agency is involved in the greatest cover-up of the free speech in U.S. history. But yeah, I'll tell you what the court says. It says people involved with your agency were meeting regularly with the social media platforms and giving them lists of persons and information that they said should be pulled off the internet, suppressed. That means turned down, volume censored so no one saw it. And the court said millions of free speech protected postings were not seen by the American people prior to the 2022 election because your employees subjectively determined that they shouldn't see it. That's the problem. And the idea that you would sit here in front of us and pretend like you don't know that was happening is just alarming. I'm out of words to describe how frustrated we are with you and your department. I'm out of time.
Gentleman from Oregon yields back. The gentlelady from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, Secretary Mayorkas. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your patience and your testimony. Mr. Secretary, as you know, DHS is responsible for the public safety of the United States of America, and the men and the women at DHS work very hard every day so that Americans can pursue the freedoms of their everyday lives. And the mission of DHS is somewhat ubiquitous, be it at airports or disaster sites, that many overlook the fact that much of it is the same federal agency. In addition to these crucial areas, DHS has also been active in combating America's gun violence epidemic, which of course I am extremely invested in. It's an issue that is very important to me, as many other survivors around the country as well. Studies have shown that between 70 to 90% of weapons recovered from crime scenes in Mexico can be traced back to the United States of America. With weapons of war commercially available at low levels of individual scrutiny, gun traffickers have been taking immense advantage of our nation's gun laws, which are very lax, to arm drug cartels that also fuel a lot of organized crime. In addition, we have seen that payment for these gun traffickers has at times resulted in opioids that have helped our communities be torn apart as well. DHS has been swiftly, as you have mentioned over and over again today, combating these kind of illicit dealings through its joint efforts with the ATF-led Operation Southbound. Mr. Secretary, DHS has taken a collaborative approach with the ATF-led Operation Southbound. Can you tell us just a little bit more about this operation? I believe a lot of people don't really know that it exists, and DHS's role in it. We'd like to hear about that and the results of this operation.
Congressman, one of the concerns that law enforcement has is that the firearms that are in the hands of the transnational criminal organizations to the south of our border actually emanated from the United States. And we, in the Department of Homeland Security, through our Homeland Security investigations, working in collaboration, as you have noted, with other federal agencies, are conducting operations to interdict the flow of firearms outside, from within the United States, external countries, and to prevent them from reaching the hands of criminals. And I would be very pleased, given the law enforcement sensitivity of the operations, to provide you with greater details about how we are accomplishing that objective.
Thank you so much. And with weapons of war, such as high-capacity automatic firearms easily available in far greater quantities in the United States than ever before, can you illustrate how these firearms trafficking, how the firearm trafficking contributes to organized crime and gun violence in the United States?
Well, the trafficking in the guns themselves is a criminal activity that is a for-profit activity. So when the criminal organizations gain greater profits, they only tragically expand their criminality. In addition, the transnational criminal organizations that receive the weaponry from the United States conduct violent acts that impact individuals who seek to enter the United States, as well as Americans themselves.
Thank you. And can you tell us a little bit more about how the export of these weapons of war directly relate to the opioid crisis in our communities in the United States?
It is the criminality of these organizations is inextricably intertwined with one another. They conduct their operations by protecting themselves and addressing law enforcement through criminal means, and that includes violent acts. And those violent acts are perpetrated with firearms, and sometimes those firearms originate from the United States. It is a web of criminality, and we are unrelenting in our efforts to disrupt and dismantle every aspect of that criminality. I'm intensely proud of the men and women who dedicate their lives to that effort in the Department of Homeland Security and throughout our law enforcement partner community.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate your dedication and those that serve right along with you in this manner. We really appreciate you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I have rarely been more gobsmacked by the lack of cooperation and information from a witness than I have by you today. It is truly appalling when you consider that lives are at stake, the lives of children being trafficked across this border, who are being sacrificed on an altar of radical policies being pushed by your department. You know, you talked about it, you threw out a good one-liner in your testimony about child sex trafficking, human smuggling. You know what does immense damage to our efforts to combat human trafficking, sex trafficking, child sex trafficking? A porous border. And your policies have directly led to that porous border, Mr. Secretary. It is ridiculous that I've had to sit here and listen to you and your denials, your deflections, your obfuscations. The mendacity that I am hearing from you is not just appalling to me, it is appalling to my constituents, and I echo the comments from across this country, members who represent people from across this country over the last 2 hours plus, really echoing their constituents and the frustration that they have actually shown and talked to them about. You know, back in April, we had a committee hearing where there was a witness, a whistleblower, who said that the U.S. federal government has essentially become a middleman in a multi-billion-dollar human trafficking operation targeting unaccompanied minors at the southern border. I'm sure that makes you upset. It sure as heck made me upset. But when U.S. Customs and Border Protection encounters 435 unaccompanied minors per day, drug cartels and traffickers exploiting 60% of these children in prostitution, forced labor, and child pornography. To make matters worse, in June, the Biden administration released 344 children to non-related adults in the United States, most of whom already had multiple children in their care. These children are prime targets for traffickers, for sex, or for labor. In fact, a February New York Times article published showing migrants found laboring in violation of child labor laws. Notably, half of the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement's most wanted criminals for child trafficking, guess where they come from? Mexico. Imagine that. So when you actually take actions that reduce operational control of the border, these are actions that are taken in contradiction of your official duty to execute the laws enacted by Congress and your oath to support and defend the Constitution. You have abandoned the successful border policies of the previous administration. You've ignored laws requiring detention of certain aliens, reduced detention capacity, ended migrant protection protocols, halted border wall construction, diverted Border Patrol from law enforcement duties, encouraged en masse illegal immigration with the use of easily exploitable credible fear processes, illegal expanded parole, reinstated catch and release, and provided illegal aliens valid work permits and public benefits during an economic downturn. You should be ashamed. More so, you should be held accountable. This committee will do just that, and I am committed to making that happen as well. And with that, I'm going to yield the remainder of my time to the chairman.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding. I would yield, well, actually, Mr. Klein, can you yield to Mr. Roy and then maybe to Mr. Bishop?
I'll yield to Mr. Roy.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia. Despite enormous levels of encounters, I believe last month was about 146,000, far exceeding what Obama DHS Secretary Jay Johnson said at crisis levels of being 1,000 a week. We can agree, I think, that it's possible there may be a decrease from FY22 to FY23 for total Border Patrol encounters, right? They're going down maybe 20%, according to data I see at current levels. Does that sound right?
I think they, Congressman, I think they're going down further in light of the approaches that we implemented in a post-Title 42.
Okay, well, assuming they're going down and accepting that they may be going down by Border Patrol encounters, hasn't there simultaneously been a significant and continuing increase at the ports of entry, which more than offset the reductions and illustrate the shell game? OFO encounters from FY22 to FY23, the data I have at current pace is a 100% increase. FY20 to FY23, a 356% increase from 241,000 to 1.1 million. In other words, the American people need to be told the truth about what's actually happening. The total numbers, if you look at the nationwide encounters, FY20 to FY21, a 202% increase. FY20 to 22, a 328% increase. FY20 to FY23 at current pace, a 364% increase. In the last 24 hours for Border Patrol alone, nationwide encounters are 6,000. That's the data I have. Is that correct?
Congressman, our approach of expanding lawful pathways and delivering consequences is working.
But is that data correct? Are those the numbers?
I'd have to confirm the numbers that you have cited.
Well, those are the numbers that we have, and this is what the American people are tired of. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for being here, Secretary Mayorkas. St. Louis and I are here today, as always, to ask hard questions about real issues. Secretary Mayorkas, I'm concerned that the department and the Office of Intelligence and Analysis in particular encourages the targeting of protesters, activists, incarcerated people, and progressive movements. For example, in 2020, under the prior administration, intelligence and analysis labeled individuals protesting police brutality and racial injustice after the killing of George Floyd as domestic violent extremists. And department leadership instructed officials to create and share intelligence dossiers about, quote, everyone participating in Portland protests, unquote, as part of a discredited effort to link protesters to a non-existent terrorism plot. And these issues still continue to this day. Secretary Mayorkas, do you acknowledge that the department has referred to opponents of the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center, or what we call Cop City, as alleged domestic violent extremists and militants comprising violent far-left occupation? And that's just a yes or no.
Well, Congresswoman, a few things, I must say. First, I'm immensely proud of the men and women who work in the Office of Intelligence and Analysis under the superb leadership of Kenneth Weinstein. They do tremendous work in making sure the American people are safe and secure. I am familiar with activities in Atlanta that are lawful, and I am also familiar with activities to which you refer that are unlawful. And we do not condone violence. We do safeguard and protect the free expression of speech.
So what you're saying is that this alleged domestic violent extremists or militants that you're saying that you condemn that language and you condemn. I'm just trying to be clear, because we can't both sides it when people are actually being hurt, and I can speak to it as an actual activist myself, and I've been there. I've seen what actually happens to protesters and what actually makes the media and what actually makes the reports. So I just want to make sure that we're saying that are you saying you domestic violent extremists, because I have the report here, are you saying that you condemn that, or that is part of the work?
Congresswoman, lawful protest is a proud tradition in this country. There cannot be a connectivity between an ideology and the expression of that ideology through violent means. That is when we get involved to prevent violence. Individuals are free to express their ideologies, whatever we might think of those ideologies.
Okay, let me, I have limited time. Let me reclaim my time. Let me go to my next question. So are you aware that Georgia law enforcement officials have used those characterizations to support their charges of domestic terrorism against opponents of Cop City?
I am not, Congressman. I can't speak to state activity, state law enforcement. What I can do is speak of what we in the Department of Homeland Security do.
Because when we don't call it out, when we don't address it, that's what happens. And I get it. You're not a part of the state, and you can't tell the state what to do, or you're not, as intricately involved in that. But when we don't speak up to it and we know it's happening, then they are able to do those things, and that's what this report is about. And it actually affects real people. And let me just also say, the people that show up to protest are usually the ones that care about the issue and are trying to save lives. Folks don't show up to protest usually unless they are sent there, and I know that happens too. But generally, the people that are at the protest, we care. Those folks are showing up because they want to see something done about policing in this community, in this country. They want to stop the fact that every single year we have a rise in police killings, and nobody is doing the actual work to fix it. And so by saying, hey, we're going to show up and put our bodies on the line, and then turning that around to make it as though those are the folks who are violent, those are the folks who are extreme. If you stop the police violence in this community, in this country, then nobody has to show up for a protest. Let me just say that. And lastly, I will say that I'm concerned about the department's policies against related to immigration enforcement. But I will make sure that we get this documentation to you because I am out of time. But lastly, I would like, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record all the documents that I just spoke of.
Without objection, the gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Lee, and then we'll go to Mr. Bandrew.
Secretary Mayorkas, Florida's Attorney General has sued the Department of Homeland Security in the Northern District of Florida, asserting that the policies of your administration violate existing federal law. Federal Judge Alan Weatherall, who has heard evidence and testimony related to your policies, described your parole with alternatives to detention policy as follows. The evidence establishes that the administration have effectively turned the southern border into a meaningless line in the sand and little more than a speed bump for aliens flooding into the country by prioritizing alternatives to detention over actual detention and by releasing 1 million aliens into the country on parole or pursuant to the exercise of prosecutorial discretion under a wholly inapplicable statute without even initiating removal proceedings. Thereafter, after additional proceedings and evidence and testimony, the judge heard about your parole with conditions revision, which allows illegal immigrants to be paroled into the U.S. under the expectation that they will check in 60 days and receive a notice to appear at a hearing where we can initiate removal proceedings in court. And there, the judge noted that all totaled, only 18% of the aliens released under the parole with conditions policy after it was enjoined by the court have been issued a notice to appear and placed in removal proceedings. The additional 82% are either awaiting the issuance of an NTA or their whereabouts are unknown. Secretary Mayorkas, can you tell us as we sit here today, where are the people who have entered this country and been released under your, what you refer to as a parole program, where are they today?
Congresswoman, the individuals who are released, because we do not have the detention capacity, we are not funded for the detention capacity to detain everyone. But let me assure you that individuals who pose a threat—
Do you know where they are, Secretary Mayorkas?
Congresswoman, if I may, I want to assure you that individuals who pose a threat to public safety or national security are detained. That is how we prioritize our detention authorities. Otherwise, we place individuals who are not such a threat on alternatives to detention.
And do you know where those individuals are?
Those individuals are—
That would be a yes or no, Secretary Mayorkas.
And those individuals are
And I'll
supervised—
take it that in this case, you do not. Now, about those who do not show up for failure to appear proceedings, for these notices to come to court, what are the consequences that those individuals face?
those individuals face the consequence of apprehension and removal.
Is it not true that it would be necessary to know who they are and where they are in order to actually initiate removal proceedings from the United States?
There are those individuals whom we do know where they are, and we do initiate removal proceedings. And if individuals abscond, which is a concern that long predates this administration, Congresswoman, we have had absconders for many, many administrations. we have between 11 and 12 million undocumented people. When those individuals are apprehended, they are also subject to immigration.
Secretary Mayorkas, what I will note is this. In addition to it being clear that the department has failed to timely respond to requests for information and data about the policies of this administration and the status of all of these individuals who have been released into our country, it is also clear from reviewing a record of the proceedings in the Florida federal court that the department is failing to comply with orders of that court. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time
Would the
to the chair.
gentleman yield to the gentleman from North Carolina?
Yes, I will yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from North Carolina.
I thank the gentlewoman. And Mr. Mayorkas, you've spoken a lot about lawful pathways you've created. And I think you rely on your parole authority to do that. Is that right?
That is one of the methods, yes, Congressman.
What other method besides parole? What other source of authority besides parole?
That is the primary
Well,
method.
I know.
No,
But what's the other one, then, if it's the primary one?
well, refugee processing is a lawful pathway.
Okay, and that's established by statute, the refugee
Yes,
program.
and the parole authority is also codified in statute. It's a discretionary.
Right, so here's what it says. It says, Attorney General may, in his discretion, parole into the United States temporarily under such conditions as he may prescribe only on a case-by-case basis for urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit any alien applying for admission to the United States. And you've spoken today, it was interesting to me, what attracted my attention. You spoke about case-by-case being an individual determination. What is the source of authority that allows you to define categories or classes to then operate, to bring people in and then look at them case-by-case?
Congressman, as I've stated, we exercise that parole authority on a case-by-case basis.
But you define these categories or classes. What allows you to do that? What authority do you rely on?
That defines the perimeter of individuals who may become eligible for the case-by-case adjudications.
Seems in tension to me. I yield.
Yeah, good point. Gentlelady from Vermont's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I begin, I ask unanimous consent to request to enter into the record DHS data on U.S. immigration and customs enforcement.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Thank you for your public service. And I'm going to just shift gears a little bit here. As you know, Vermont has recently experienced the worst flooding in our state since the 1920s. Farms, houses, apartments, mobile homes, businesses, and shared community spaces have been devastated, including nearly every single small business in our downtown of our state capital, Montpelier. I've seen the destruction firsthand and can tell you the recovery is going to be long and hard. Related to this, a larger issue I'd like to highlight with my time today is the lack of options for small businesses that cannot take on additional debt to rebuild. SBA loans, of course, are a great help, but they are still loans, and we are a rural state made up primarily of small businesses. Of the 79,000 small businesses in our tiny state, 78% are independent contractors, are non-employer businesses. So it is incredibly challenging for these small businesses to rebuild and take on more liabilities. But their presence in these communities is absolutely vital. We are a rural state made up of small cities and towns and villages, all in these little river valleys, which are essentially isolated from each other. And we need the ability to rebuild these small businesses. So I've heard directly from these folks that they're having a really hard time imagining how they will rebuild. FEMA has been incredible. They were on the ground just a few days after the emergency. I was able to tour with FEMA leadership as well as folks from Region 1. We are grateful for that help, but I want to make sure that over the long term, we are committed to working with FEMA and DHS to make sure that we find some long-term solutions for small businesses in particular to fill in this gap in the recovery. Along these lines, Mr. Secretary, what can Congress do to aid DHS and FEMA in continuing to react to natural disasters like this, like the flooding in Vermont, which was supposed to be a 100-year flood cycle, and it happened as recently as 12 years ago. So what can we do to partner with you to be more prepared for these?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. I look forward to partnering with you and other members of the committee to address the challenges that our nation faces. One critical need is, of course, funding for the disaster relief services and assistance that we provide, whether that is financial relief so that businesses and individuals alike can rebuild and recover. We also have critical grant programs that really contribute to the resilience of local communities. That is one very significant way in which we can partner together, and I very much look forward to working with you.
Thank you. And just to put a finer point on it, I was speaking with FEMA Administrator Criswell when she came up to Vermont. Is it accurate to say that FEMA's primary funding source, the Disaster Relief Fund, is going to go into the red as soon as August? Is that correct?
That is correct, Congresswoman.
Can you talk about the importance of DRF funding, especially as we prepare for another hurricane season and these increasingly intense storms that we are bound to see continually as the air warms?
The Disaster Relief Fund is the nucleus of our efforts to assist communities in recovering from natural disasters, which are only increasing in frequency and severity. That is the core fund through which we provide such needed relief for communities across this country, whether it's hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, flooding, the natural disasters that we are seeing more and more often.
Thank you. Just two more questions. Is there a role for the agency in mitigating future disasters? You know, we often move emergency supplementals after the fact. Is there value to more focused funding for pre-disaster work, and what would that look like?
Well, one of the takeaways that I had when I visited Mayfield, Kentucky, with Congressman Comer following a devastating tornado is assisting communities in revising their building codes so that they are ready for the weather that we encounter today and not the weather that we encountered 10 years ago. We really, as a nation, have to reform our infrastructure architecture to be ready for the extreme weather events that we are encountering today and will encounter tomorrow.
Thank you. I know I'm just about out of time. I just want to make the final point here is that I think it's going to be important for all of us long-term to think about how FEMA also can be a partner in dealing with the mental health consequences of these disasters, especially as they're happening more frequently. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Secretary, we'll do one more, and then we got to go to votes on the floor, and then we'll come back after that. Mr. Van Drew is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mayorkas, we stand here yet again to address a crisis that you've continued to make worse. As Secretary of Homeland Security, the American people have entrusted you with the security of their communities and the security of their nation. You have failed them. Our southern border has been turned into a revolving door for illegal immigration, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and threats to our national security. Is this the America we want? An America where every town is a border town? An America where our communities, infrastructure, and resources are strained under the weight of unchecked illegal immigration? We know the answer. Our constituents know the answer. The answer is no. The reality is that under your leadership, you've created the largest border crisis in the history of the United States of America. A crisis so badly handled that the International Organization, and I want everybody to listen to this, the International Organization for Migration labeled our southwest border as, quote, the deadliest land crossing in the world, end quote. Unbelievable for America. Are you aware of how many illegals have been encountered at our border and how many known gotaways have escaped into America? And I just want the numbers.
Congressman, you speak of the Southwest.
Sir,
border,
I just want the numbers.
And the challenge of migration that we face.
Thank you. I appreciate your answer. It's 5.6 million illegal alien encounters and 1.5 million known gotaways. How about the number of aliens on the terrorist screening database who have been caught? Not the ones who haven't been caught, but the ones who've been caught just in the last 9 months. Do you know that number?
I'm very pleased to provide that to you.
I do. It's 140. Thank you. How about the number unaccompanied minors processed in FY23? Do you know that number?
Similarly, Congressman, I'd be very pleased to provide.
Thank you. I know that number myself. It's 152,000. We have seen a continuous surge of fentanyl coming from China. being distributed by Mexican drug cartels and destroying countless American lives. Are you aware of how many Americans died? How many Americans died in 2021 at the hands of fentanyl?
I am aware of those numbers, Congressman.
71,000. 71,000 human souls. These numbers are staggering, and they are a direct result of your actions as Secretary, actions that have dismantled effective immigration policies and broken the rule of law. Your lies to Congress and the American people that put American citizens in danger every single day. And in my mind, this makes your actions criminal. All of this leaves us at a crossroads, a moment in time where our actions will define the future of the United States of America. This is a call to action, a call to restore sanity at our borders and safety in our communities, a call to ensure that every town in America is no longer a border town. In the words of Ronald Reagan, quote, "A nation that cannot control its borders is not a nation," end quote. The time for action is now. Congress cannot stand by. So we arrive at an inevitable conclusion that I do not take lightly. Secretary Mayorkas, you must resign. Will you resign?
No, I will not. I am incredibly proud of the work that is performed
I understand.
in the Department of Homeland
Secretary Mayorkas, if you will not resign, that leaves us with no other option. You should be impeached. And I yield back to the chairman.